longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of the Netherlands. He's also leader, and has been for many years, of the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. And I discovered in my research that he was an historian who studied history at Leiden, and I'm hoping that he will bring some historical as well as personal perspective to what we're going to discuss. Sitting next to him between us, Rebecca Greenspan is Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That's UNCTAD, which is a hard thing to say, and she's been doing that job since 2021. Before that, she was UN Under-Secretary General and the Associate Administrator of the UN Development Programme. But if you go back to before her time at the UN, she's nearly been 20 years at the UN, she was Vice President of Costa Rica from 1994 to 1998. In the audience is one of your former students from your time as a Professor of Economics, who gave you a rave review. You'll be glad
I was serious now.
Well, we're all going to try to be very serious. And this is an interactive town hall meeting, quite different from things as they have traditionally been at the WEF. In the past, it would just be a panel, they would pontificate, and you would check your email. But this is going to be different, because what we're going to do is get you to interact with us. There are not going to be speeches. There's going to be a lot of Q&A. I've got to tell you a few things. If you are the kind of person who likes social media, please use the hashtag #WEF24. You can react to questions and pose questions via Slido. If you've never used Slido before, it's a way of distracting moderators who are trying to have a conversation. To start distracting me, use that QR code there. Then you have to make sure you choose the right room. We're in the Aula room, A-U-L-A, and it says, use the WEF hashtag Davos24, choose the right room at the top of your screen, and as I said, that room is Aula. And if you've been here before, I think you have to reselect the room for Slido to work. To set the scene, we're not going to have speeches, we're going to have some opinion poll questions. In fact, we've got 3. And the first question is, how much do you trust existing governance mechanisms? Do you definitely trust them? Rather trust them? Rather don't trust them? Definitely don't trust them? Hard to say. And I think the polling should start now. Okay. We'll give it a little time. These things, like the Iowa caucuses, take a little time before the winner is declared by the networks. Vote early, but only vote once. Well, that seems like a pretty clear win for trust. In fact, a fairly clear majority, either rather trust or definitely trust, and only a quarter of people don't trust, or thereabouts. I don't want to spend too much time on this. We only have 45 minutes, but that's a win for trust, somewhat unexpectedly. But then we're with the global elite rather than the people who generally don't trust government, who don't come to Davos. The next question is, why has trust in governance mechanisms declined? Which, despite that first poll result, I think it's fair to say it has. By the way, if one looked at polling data for the general public in the US and in Europe, you would get a very different answer indeed to that first question. We are not a representative sample. Now, what we're doing here is not multiple choice. This is the word cloud system, where people select whatever word springs to mind when they're trying to explain a phenomenon, in this case, the decline of trust in governance. And we'll let it run and see what words come out. I'm seeing social media was quickly up there. Populism, over-promising politicians. Luckily, none of those are here today.
No, never.
let's just let this roll for a little longer and see what else comes up. Disinformation, I see, is there. That's at the top of the global risk report for the WEF this year as a risk over the next couple of years. And social media has pulled ahead along with disengagement. Social media and disengagement. Interesting. There are a bunch of other ideas. Polarizing, too much data gathering, lack of privacy. But the dominant idea in the word cloud here, dominant ideas are social media and disengagement. Shall we go on to the third and final of these questions? Well, what can be done to restore trust in governance? We're going to use the word cloud method again and see what comes up. Transparency has edged into the lead, more direct democracy, multilateral reform, I suspect we'll get to.
Younger politicians.
Younger politicians.
Shouldn't get in that direction.
In the UK, they're so young, they're young enough to be my children these days.
And France.
And France too. In the United States, we have a slightly different approach to the age of our populations. You have to be at least 80. Transparency and responsible media seem to be leading. But you can see that a lot of ideas in both these word clouds have come up. And I think it's quite refreshing how many different ideas have been put forward. Well, although one could happily let these word clouds continue to form, I think we should turn now to our expert speakers for some reactions, not only to the polls, but let me start with you, Mark, someone who spent a long time at the head of a national polity. Do you agree that there's a crisis of trust, firstly? I don't know if that's something you want to answer just with respect to the Netherlands. And if there is, what can be done about it?
The problem, of course, is always difficult if people on the panel start to discuss the question. But you could also have a fantastic governance system in a dictatorship. So somehow we have to make sure that governance and politics and the political decision-making process are a bit separate from each other. But in the end, I think governance is pulling together the political decision-making and then how the political decision-making is in reality playing out in society. Yes, in my country, people feel that things are made too complex, that there is a lack of transparency, that politicians are not always opening up on all the information they should be giving. And what I've found over the years is that the sheer complexity is a real issue to deal with this, because in a country like mine, with almost 80 million people, a fundamentally high-trust society, with a high level of, let's say, prosperity and a high income. And when you then collect about 400 billion out of a 1,000 billion euro-dollar economy, 400 billion to redistribute through the government system, there are all these issues of equity and making sure that everybody gets involved and that everybody is treated in the same way, etc. And that makes laws, decision-making extremely complex. And what I tried over the years is to find ways to make things simple. So if you, for example, decide to have the implementation of a policy not at a national level, but at a local level, to then make sure that at a national level you're not continuing in having oversight and having all the details of what is happening at the local level. No, now then it is to the local municipalities. And we see each of the countries in Europe struggling with this issue. The centrist state, the decentralized state, Germany, a federal state, France since Louis XIV, and here my history comes into play. Louis XIV, we know that there is a very centralized state, which of course takes a lot of power away from the local communities. So all these issues are at play. And maybe to build the bridge to UNCTAD and the international legal order and the multilateral organizations, we see the same here, that people, and I can talk about the EU, NATO, the UN, that people sometimes feel even this organization, which is non-governmental, there is a lot of mistrust what the WEF is doing, that we are here with the world elite without any transparency deciding on who will win the next European Championship and who will be the next president of the US. Now, we are not, I can tell you, but that lack of transparency and how then to build that in the system is really an issue.
So before I turn to Rebecca, can I ask a follow-up question? Obviously, populism was one of the things that popped up on the screen, and the Netherlands is a good example of this, where Geert Wilders did better, I think, than many people expected in the recent election. And a lot of people connect social media and populism, and they argue that simplification of political issues is what the populists are good at, and social media helps them do that. Give us a sense of what you experienced in the Netherlands, and do you see the rise of populism as essentially a byproduct of lack of trust in governance?
To a certain extent, but it would make it too easy, because in the end it is up to the traditional, let's say, broad people's parties in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, also in the United Kingdom and in the US, to make sure that you keep the attention to the way these parties are trying to solve the big issues and to debate them. And that means that we also have to make use of social media in a much more modern way maybe than we're doing currently, and learn one or two things from the populists. But in the Netherlands, so I'm not against populism. There is the wrong side of populism, telling people that things are easy, that the traditional parties cannot solve them, and we have the simple answers, and we then know that this will end in a lot of mistrust 4 years later. But there's also the good type of populism, getting the issues on the table. And the main issue in the last Dutch elections was migration. People support that in the Netherlands we have people fleeing from war and poverty, etc. And we have to give them a safe place in the Netherlands. But we cannot handle 1,000 a week as we currently have. That will bring us to 50 to 70,000 a year. That's simply too high. It's a political statement, of course. This is my view on this. But many would concur, and then, of course, the main political parties in the center need to have an answer. And somehow we have not been able to provide that answer in this election sufficiently for people not to vote for Geert Wilders.
So, Rebecca, that gives us a bridge to the kind of issues you've spent nearly 2 decades grappling with, because migration is obviously not a problem, mass migration, mass refugee flows, that can be solved by national governments on their own. It requires international agencies. Now, I would think it's fair to say that there's quite a lot of scepticism about the United Nations these days. That the example that comes to my mind was the meeting of the UN Security Council on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, when, in fact, the Russian ambassador was in the chair, and my 11-year-old son was incredulous and asked if he was watching Saturday Night Live. And I said, no, that is, in fact, the UN Security Council, which is chairing, is having an event, a meeting chaired by a Russian on the eve of a Russian invasion. Do you think there's been a decline of trust in the UN generally in your time? And if so, why? And then I want to ask you about how that trust can be rebuilt.
Okay. First of all, you know, I really think that trust is a scarce commodity right now. So I was surprised by the poll. Yeah. And obviously, it reflects this group, but it doesn't reflect the majority of the world. Yeah. Yeah? I think that there is this mistrust between the North and the South, the West and the East, the developed and the developing, yes? And part of the problem of migration comes from that too. The truth is that we have seen in the last years a regress in many of the things that we achieved before. Yes, we saw an increase in poverty, an increase in inequality, a decrease for the first time in 20 years since we measured it in the Human Development Index. So people are suffering, yes? Maybe markets are not suffering so much now, but people are suffering. And there is a disconnect, yes? One of the numbers that I give is that 3.3 billion people are living in countries that right now spend more in servicing the debt than on education or health. And that says something about the quality of life of the people of these countries. There is a debt crisis, is to discuss, yes? But many of the international organizations say, no, we are not in a debt crisis, because there is no debt crisis in the markets, but there is a crisis with the people. And I think that that disconnect is part of the mistrust also in the international organizations. It's not only the UN, it's also the Bretton Woods institutions. Yes? We need really to, and I like a phrase that Nana reminded me today from the SG that says that we need to build the institutions for our grandchildren and not stick to the institutions of our grandparents. Yes? And if we don't do that, the disconnect and the mistrust with the international system will continue. And if you allow me, I can give you some numbers that really reflect that that is really the problem. So when the IMF was founded and the World Bank was founded, they have 12 seats in the board for 44 countries. Most of the African countries were not born yet at that time. No. Yes? Today, they have 25 seats for 190 countries. Yeah. So the representation has gone down, not up. Yes? If we will maintain the same proportion, we should have 52 seats in the board. Probably it's too much, but something has to be done to include more countries with more voice for a world that today is different. And the thing of the Global South with the institutions, the Bretton Woods and the Security Council, is that they don't feel represented, that they don't feel that their voice has the weight that it should have in the world of today. And that's a governance issue.
So those are very interesting points, because it seems to me they weren't in the word cloud results. What you've said is the reason trust has fallen in international institutions is that the realities of social and economic outcomes are really rather poor. And this is a function of the debt crisis that you mentioned and the broader trends in inequality around the world. And you also made a point that governance needs to be fixed by changing the representation on institutions that are now really many decades old, date back to post-World War II. Can you give us an example of something that you've been involved with recently that has shown that international governance still works? And I'm thinking here particularly of what's been going on with the Black Sea grain deal. Now, this is a really very important episode. One of the most interesting features of the war in Ukraine is that it's not just a military war, it's an economic war too. Tell us a bit about your role in that and how far you think it illustrates that these institutions can actually still deliver.
Yeah. Well, you are right, because in a way I think that the Black Sea, the possibility of having a successful initiative in the middle of the war, because we had a war going on, it's not that the war stopped. And we were able, effectively, to do something to avoid a really food insecurity crisis around the world that was, around the corner, at that moment. And that happened for two things. One is that in a way, in a way, we look through geopolitics. So, geopolitics is really, turning everything in different colors. Yes, and sometimes don't let you see through it. And I think that the Black Sea Grain Initiative, in a way, is a reflection of being able to look through. And what happened is that we looked at what was happening then, not only on the local problem and war, but what was happening with the rest of the world. The question was, what was the impact of the war in the rest of the world? And the Secretary General and his leadership, and I think in a way also the legitimacy that the UN has, because nobody else could have done it, decided to launch this initiative that said, let's put food security first. Let's try, within this geopolitical chaos, to be able to do something that is positive for the world. And he really convinced, the partners, in this case, the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Turkey played a very important role. And I have to say that in terms of our role, we couldn't have done it without a lot of partnerships. No. We partner with the countries, and in this case, and I told the Prime Minister this, Netherlands was a very constructive voice, you know, for us to be able to do what we did. And it was difficult, I have to say.
Well, I didn't expect you to succeed. One of my predictions a year ago was that there would be famine in Somalia in 2023, and it didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen because of the really rather extraordinary role that the international institutions played. I want to just turn now to the audience and remind you that you have to work too. Yeah. And that means you have to ask questions or intervene. No raising a hand. Michael Strain is quick to raise a hand, so I'll go to him first. There is a microphone. I'm also taking questions from the online audience via Slido, so, but we'll start with the live audience.
I'm Michael Strain with the American Enterprise Institute in Georgetown University. This question is slightly a provocation of my friend Niall, but it is a serious question nonetheless. In the United States, we have had a serious problem of trust in governance, which began with the 2008 financial crisis. The financial crisis was unusual for an economic downturn in that it kind of reached into the balance sheets of millions and millions of households, wiping out net worth, you know, largely through their home valuations, but also through their retirement savings accounts. It took from 2008 until 2014 for average wages, for the average wage in the United States to recover its 2007 level. Mm-hmm. So the reason I say this is a provocation of Niall, am I being too much of a historical materialist to argue that trust in government, at least over the last 15 years, has really been driven by an economic cycle, and that if we can just get back to 5-6 years of relatively broad-based growth in wages without a pandemic intervening, that we'll be feeling pretty good about trust in government?
Mark, let me ask you that question. I'll resist the temptation to rise to the bait as I'm just the moderator.
I give you the floor.
Yeah. I mean, the financial crisis impacted Europe, not perhaps quite as hard as the United States, but it nevertheless had an impact.
Somehow cushioned a bit, but... Yeah.
And it lasted longer in some ways. It took years
because of the cushion.
For the Eurozone crisis to play out. How far do you think Michael's right that at root, trust in government correlates to economic performance? If it's bad, if people are worse off, they blame government. Is that true?
Not in government, but in the government party. So I think the general trust in government is not impacted by an economic crisis. But the government party can lose the elections, clearly, if the economy is not doing well at a particular point in the electoral cycle. I think what you really need in the US, but also my country and many countries, is that people don't like politicians fighting each other with harsh words, and that there is absolutely no feeling that somehow they could get together. I almost was thinking, I was always a big fan of Ronald Reagan. And there is this fantastic moment where Tip O'Neill, who was then the Speaker of the House, and he was from the Democratic Party, and there was this moment when Tip O'Neill, I think, was 70 years old, and Ronald Reagan gave the big speech. And he said, we both disagree almost on everything, except after 6 o'clock, because then we tell each other Irish jokes. But before 6 o'clock, we disagree on everything. And then Tip O'Neill saying, Reagan is a lousy president, he would have made a hell of a king. But what you saw there is two guys respecting each other, being from totally different angles, totally different views. But there was a bipartisanship in the US in those days, which is lacking at the moment. It is not because of Trump or Biden or the Republicans or the Democrats. It simply happened somehow, probably starting in the mid-1990s, and maybe even before that. And I think people hate that. So people want to know what the issues are, but they want us as politicians to behave. And this brings me back to also your role, because leadership here is crucial. It is not only UNCTAD which was successful here in the grain deal. It was also you personally. So you need somebody there. And what I always found is that you need, as a sort of base, the rules. What do you agree upon? And then you build trust by also talking and getting everybody involved in the process. And if necessary, you have to reform. And for example, the international organizations and the international multilateral banks, for example, they are still tilting too much to the north. And we have to reform that system to make sure that the South feels more involved. And the same for the UN and for the UN Security Council. So reforms are important, but it always ends and starts with rules and talking. And in the end, behaving. And what I very much hope is that somehow we as politicians, and people hate it when politicians start to attack each other at a personal level instead of sticking to the issues.
I'll take another question from the floor. Yes, please.
Can I come in this question?
There's a risk that if you both respond to every question, we'll only have 3 questions, but very
It's true. Okay, I will restrain myself.
I will address a question to you then. Maybe I'll make it this way. So I want to build up what you said. So I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the European Stability Mechanism. We spoke about the debt crisis. So yes, I agree with you. At the markets at the moment, there is no debt crisis. So you're right. But for the feeling of the people, they feel inflation hitting them. Now, when we do the right thing, for example, in the Greek crisis, Greece had to go through big restructuring, very tough. On the Syntagma Square in Athens, people were demonstrating, fighting against the policy making. At the end, it was the best thing that could happen to Greece. Now it's one of the fastest growing economies. Now it's investment grade, and everyone loves it. And I know Mark Rutte also had to work very hard on this to get that through. So we did the right thing. Still, there is a stigma. There is a stigma with my institution, there is a stigma with the International Monetary Fund, and no one wants to touch these multilaterals because we do the right thing, but then we get punished for it. So how do we solve that? How do we solve that issue that you have spotted? What could multilateral organizations do?
Okay, so I will connect these two because I went through the debt crisis in the 80s in Latin America, and I was part of the group of the team of my country that negotiated the debt. It was the best negotiation ever, actually. We paid 16 cents per each dollar at that moment. And we started with the swaps for nature. And so let me say this. First of all, when you have a crisis, one of the problems that we, the economists, have is that we look at the flows. Yes, we recover the flows quickly or less quickly, and we feel so good when we grow again and the inflation goes down again, and all the indicators, the flow indicators are okay. But what people lost during the crisis never comes back. It needs a lot of time to be gained again. And what happens with the middle classes? They feel much more vulnerable and they are much more afraid. And that's something that we have to take into account. What you lost in the crisis, in the middle classes in Latin America, lost whatever cushion they had for anything that happened in their lives. So if something happened to their house, they couldn't repair it. If something happened to your car, they couldn't do anything about it. If you lost one thing, you couldn't, you were vulnerable. The feeling of vulnerability is very bad for politics. And most of the political parties in Latin America lost in the 90s when we were getting again growth and getting out of the crisis, and we thought everything was okay. Yes? Most of the parties didn't survive. Yes? And we had a lot of populism and we had a lot of problems coming in Latin America in the 90s because we didn't have the sensibility, is the word, in Spanish are very, the sensibility to understand the feeling of the people. We looked at the flows, but not at the area below the curve. And this happens also, I'm sorry, in Greece. You said you did the right thing. Let me tell you one thing. I will disagree a little bit. Because you always get out of a crisis. No crisis is forever. Maybe Argentina.
We'll be hearing from the new president in about 15 minutes on that subject, I suspect.
I'm sorry. But no, that was a joke. Bad joke.
Even Argentina may come out of a crisis, you never know.
My point is that if we did the right thing, should be judged through what pain people went through. And you can get out of a crisis with more pain or with less pain. And that's the real question that we have to ask. Not if we went back to the growth rate that we had before, because that is not the judgment of the people.
I'd love to dig into that question, because clearly there's no way out of a debt crisis without some pain. Just a little hard.
I didn't say no pain.
Right.
I said less or more.
But of course, it's tempting for politicians always to offer no-pain solutions when they're campaigning. And part of the problem with trust in governance is that there are almost always going to be pain, there's going to be losses. And so with debt crises, the question is, how do you tell the right solution? This is going to be a huge issue in many African countries this year. It was a big issue in European countries in the time of the Eurozone crisis. But who decides? What's the right answer when clearly losses have to be allocated somewhere? How does one know?
Okay, but are all losses fair? You know, many of these countries went into debt because of the pandemic, because they didn't have any other choice. Yes, they cannot print money in the developing countries. Yes, they have no reserve currency. Mm-hmm. So the only way they could get out of the pandemic or, answer to some of the demands of the people was by debt. And then you had this hike in interest rates that was not their fault. It was the reserve banks, the ones that increased the rates. And that's why the debt exploded in many of these countries. Not all countries were really indebted.
Is that an argument for large-scale debt forgiveness as a solution?
This is an argument to have a restructuring mechanism for debt that works. I am not saying you can pardon the debt to everybody, but you have to have a restructuring mechanism that works. It cannot be that it takes you 3 years to have a deal and still you haven't gotten not $1, even doing the right thing. Not $1 has been disbursed to the countries that have gone through the process according to the rules that are still in place.
We could get deep into the weeds of debt crises, but I'm going to take another question and see where we go. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Forum for this great town hall format. I'm Simon O'Connell. I'm the CEO of SNV, Netherlands Development Organization, and for me, my short answer to how we restore trust in governance is we redistribute power, we make it more local, and we resolve those inequities of opportunity. There's a lot of discussion here in the Forum around what we need to do is solve the issues around mis- or disinformation, but I think actually there's a much more profound point, if I may, around it's actually around access to information itself. And the reality is where my organization's been working, 50 plus years in the Sahel. If you're from North Mali now, if you're from Gao, you know about those inequalities more than ever before. If you're from Boer in Western Central African Republic, you're aware of those pervasive inequalities. You're increasingly aware of the dysfunctioning of the multilateral system. So what do we need to do in order to convince those people in Gao in North Mali or in Boer in the Central African Republic that there's a sincerity around the reforms that are needed in those multilateral institutions, or there's a sincerity around something like Global Gateway out of the EU, which is a 300 billion euro investment, yes, in part to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. But what do we need to do to really convince them that that is going to result in economic dividends and, yes, growth in those countries as well?
Let me ask you to tackle that first, Mark, because immigration is a huge issue in a country like the Netherlands, and that's because people have a very clear incentive to get out of the poorer countries of Northern Africa and try to make better lives if they can get to Europe.
Yes, if they come for purely economical reasons, they cannot stay. Then we have to be very strict and get them back to the country they come from. But of course, if they come as genuine asylum seekers, then it is different. And then we somehow have to make sure that not the burden is completely on Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden, but that we distribute that fairly. And that's what we are trying to do at the European level.
And are the European countries doing enough to address this point that until there's growth in those countries, people will keep coming?
But it's not only to the European Union. Yes, for example, with countries in the north of Africa, we try to make multilateral agreements, not only focusing on migration, but also on economic growth, on improving the quality of governance in those countries. And I think one of the issues here, obviously, in Mali and in some of the other G5 Sahel countries, is also the quality of the government and the governance. It's not always easy from outside to help, because it can be seen as condescending. It can be seen as, well, it's running against African solutions for African problems. But obviously, somehow you need to have that discussion starting to make sure that, for example, the G5 Sahel, you can stabilize the situation. Because otherwise it will continue. And that means that the individual there will still suffer. By the way, this also is linked to the other debates we just had, because I think the problem with multilateralism and organizations like the ESM is that outside the country which is getting the money, people think they get it without any strings attached. So why is our money going to Greece? And in Greece, they sense that they have really to do more than could be reasonably expected. And the fear of falling, and I think is exactly what you were just describing, the fear of falling, that you move from the middle class to the low income, that happens because you can simply not any longer deal with a big life event like a divorce or somebody getting ill or you're losing your job. People sensing that, and then the state not providing a sufficient support is the fast track to a rise of the populist parties.
Can I ask you to respond to Rebecca, because obviously you work a lot on this question. Your remarks about debt crises suggest a kind of fundamental dissatisfaction with the way we handle the problems of poverty in less developed economies. Is there a better way for the international agencies to help those countries achieve growth, or are defects in their national governance an insuperable obstacle to growth?
You need both. You need good governance inside the countries, and you need transparency, and you need anti-corruption laws, and you need the right policies. There is no doubt about it. But that won't be enough, yes? International flows for developing countries turned negative last year. So these countries that need more capital, that need more investment, that need more trade, have seen trade and investment being very weak, and flows going from the south to the north and not from the north to the south. So something has to be done, to revert.
Even the countries which have improved their governance.
Well, Ghana. Ghana defaulted, yes? Yeah. Wasn't Ghana like the good student and Ghana defaulted? And it was not because they didn't try, it was because the international conditions didn't allow them, to keep a debt that was too expensive and too short term. So here there is things that we can do. We have put an agenda to make the international financial system bigger. The World Bank is today a fifth of what it was in the 60s with respect to the GDP. And the challenges are more. We want a stronger IMF, we want a stronger World Bank, but we want better models for the developing countries. And that's something that we can do, because it's something that we can capitalize, and we can take the decisions in the governance body. They have deep pockets right now, and if the governance body, if the boards will take the decision that they have to take, it will be much better for everybody. I don't know why that doesn't happen.
We're almost out of time. We're into the last 5 minutes of this all too brief session. I want to take at least one question from the virtual audience, otherwise I shall get indignant emails. We've had several. The one I'm going to ask is in a quite different vein. Anonymous asks, there's a security paradox. Life is safer than ever. He's certainly talking about developed countries, but people are also more controlled by governments. Have governments fallen through in their drive to control citizens? Mark, it's certainly true that governments have more power over citizens than they did 100 years ago. And governments got much bigger just in terms of its economic size. Do you think that power that government has accumulated over the last century or so is part of the reason that trust has diminished?
I don't think directly, but if then that power is not used in a correct sense, then yes, we had in the Netherlands this scandal with money being given to parents who have their children in daycare. Some of these families were completely devastated and were basically in an extremely difficult position, and this led to some awful situations for tens of thousands of people. So these things happen. We see now this thing in the UK with this sub-postmaster. Yes. I don't understand all the details of it, but I'm trying to see from the BBC website. So when as a government, and this is because we are redistributing so much money through the health service and through the social care system. And as I said, in the case of my country, about 1/3 of our national income is being redistributed through pensions, social care and healthcare. And that means that you need to have some oversight that gives the government more power, but then we make the system so complex that sometimes things go horribly wrong. And obviously that is then creating a huge crisis of confidence.
Well, this may be the appropriate segue to the next session in the World Economic Forum programme, which is the Libertarian President of Argentina arguing the government has got much too big in his country, and part of his solution is a drastic deregulation and a drastic shrinkage of government. I'm sure some people here will want to go and hear what he has to say. It only remains for me, let me just make sure there's no vital instruction that I'm missing. Oh yes, it says I should summarise the 3 to 5 key takeaways from the discussion in 30 seconds. I think what we've taken away from this, and it's really been a fascinating conversation, is that there has been a decline of trust in governance, not amongst the kind of people who come to the World Economic Forum, but out there in the wider world. And it takes many different forms, it has many different explanations. The situation in impoverished parts of Africa is radically different from the situation in prosperous countries like the Netherlands. We've highlighted, thanks to Rebecca, the importance of the debt crisis. We avoided a famine last year, but we've walked right into a debt crisis this year. I'm really glad you brought that up. It's going to be a huge issue in Africa and elsewhere in the rest of the year. And as Mark has said, I mean, part of the reason that trust goes down is that government perhaps aspires to do too much, and the sheer complexity of modern developed government is bound to lead to over-promising and under-delivering. Not that you ever did that in your time as Prime Minister. Mark perished.
Not totally
perished the
without
thought. Well, I guess, congratulate you on your final WEF as Prime Minister.
You never know.
Well, spoken like a true politician. I'd like everybody in the live audience to join me in thanking our brilliant panellists.
Thank you so much, Mark. Hey, very good.